I remember my wedding day as the brightest, most perfect moment of my life, or at least that is what I told myself for a long time. The sun was shining perfectly through the windows of the dressing room, and the scent of fresh lilies filled the air. Everything felt like a dream come true. Standing right there next to me was Sarah, my best friend since we were 5 years old. We had shared every secret, every heartbreak, and every success since we were children. She was more than a friend, she was the sister I never had. As she helped me fasten the tiny lace buttons on the back of my dress, I noticed her hands were shaking. I looked at her in the mirror and saw that her eyes were already red and puffy. I smiled at her, thinking how lucky I was to have someone who loved me so much that they could feel my happiness this deeply. "Don't start crying yet, Sarah," I joked. "You'll ruin your makeup before the ceremony even starts." She tried to smile back, but it looked more like a painful grimace. She whispered that she was just overwhelmed because she had waited for this day for me for so long. Throughout the morning she was unusually quiet. Usually, Sarah is the life of the party, the one making jokes and keeping everyone's energy high, but that day she seemed to be drifting in and out of the room mentally. When the music started and I walked down the aisle toward Mark, I glanced at the front row where she stood as my maid of honor. She wasn't just soft crying, she was shaking. Her shoulders were hunched and she held her bouquet so tightly her knuckles were white. During the vows, when Mark promised to be mine forever, I heard a small sob escape her lips. People in the audience whispered about how sweet it was. They thought it was a beautiful testament to our friendship. I felt a surge of pride and warmth, thinking that our bond was so strong that my joy was literally overflowing from her eyes. I didn't see the sadness in those tears then. I didn't see the grief. I only saw love because that was all I had ever given her. I spent the rest of the night dancing and laughing, completely blind to the fact that the person I trusted most in the world was mourning something right in front of me. I thought she was crying for my future, but she was actually crying for a past I didn't even know existed. At the end of the night, when she hugged me goodbye, she held on a little too long and whispered, "I'm so sorry," into my ear. I thought she meant she was sorry for being such a mess during the ceremony. I laughed and told her not to worry about it. I told her I loved her. She didn't say it back, she just nodded and walked away into the dark parking lot. The honeymoon was a blur of turquoise water and white sand, but when Mark and I returned to our daily life, something felt different. It wasn't a loud change, it was like a slow leak in a tire that you don't notice until the steering starts to pull. I expected to settle into a cozy, newlywed rhythm, but instead I felt a strange, invisible wall growing between us. Mark was there, but he wasn't present. He started working later than usual, and when he was home he spent a lot of time staring at his phone or the television with a blank expression. At first I blamed the post-wedding blues, that strange crash of adrenaline after a year of planning. But then I noticed a pattern that involved Sarah. It started with small comments. If I mentioned a restaurant I wanted to go to, Mark would say, "Oh, Sarah mentioned that place was overrated," or, "Didn't Sarah say she hated that kind of food?" It was odd because Sarah and I hadn't been talking much since the wedding. Whenever I called her, she sounded tired or distracted. She always had an excuse. Work was busy, she was coming down with a cold, or she had errands to run. The girl who used to text me 10 times a day now took 2 days to reply to a simple, "How are you?" I felt like I was losing my 2 favorite people at the same time. One evening while I was making dinner, I asked Mark if he had heard from Sarah lately. He jumped, almost dropping the glass of water he was holding. He became strangely defensive, his voice rising just a pitch too high. "Why would I hear from her? She's your friend, not mine," he said, turning his back to me. I was confused by his reaction. "I just meant since she seemed so emotional at the wedding, I thought maybe she was going through something," I explained calmly. Mark didn't drop it. He went on a mini rant about how Sarah was too dramatic, and how her constant need for attention was probably why she was staying away. It was a complete 180-degree turn from how he used to treat her. Before the wedding they seemed to get along famously. They would joke around and even team up to tease me. Now he spoke about her with a mix of irritation and a strange kind of guilt that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if mentioning her name made him physically uncomfortable. I started to wonder if they had a fight that I didn't know about. I even felt bad for Mark, thinking he was stuck in the middle of some unspoken tension between my best friend and me. I tried to be the peacemaker, sending Sarah flowers, just because, and planning a surprise dinner for Mark to help him relax. I was working so hard to fix the mood of my marriage, never realizing that the foundation was already cracked. The distance between Mark and me in bed became a physical space I could measure. We would lie there side by side, both awake in the dark, but we were miles apart. I would reach for his hand and he would gently pull away, claiming he was just too hot or restless. My intuition was screaming that something was wrong, but my heart was too afraid to listen. I convinced myself that I was just being a jealous wife, or that I was being too sensitive. I told myself that every marriage has a transition period. I didn't know that the distance I felt was actually the space where a secret was living, growing larger every single day. The silence from Sarah became deafening as the weeks turned into months. We had gone from sharing every meal and every thought to barely knowing each other's schedules. Whenever I managed to get her on the phone, the conversation felt like a scripted interview. She would give me one-word answers and ask me nothing in return. It was heartbreaking because I needed her more than ever. The distance I felt from Mark was making me feel isolated and lonely in my own home. I started to wonder if I had done something to offend her. Did I ignore her too much during the wedding planning? Was I too focused on my own happiness? I even sent her a long, heartfelt email apologizing for any unintentional hurt I might have caused, telling her how much I missed my person. She replied a day later with a brief, cold message saying that she was just going through some personal growth and needed space. She didn't say she loved me back, and she didn't address any of my concerns. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at home with Mark was becoming increasingly suffocating. He became hyper-focused on his phone, taking it with him even when he went to the bathroom or the shower. If I walked into a room while he was texting, he would quickly flip the phone over or lock the screen. It was the classic behavior of someone hiding something, but I was so determined to be a cool wife that I forced myself to ignore the red flags. I didn't want to be the woman who snooped through her husband's things. I wanted to believe in the sanctity of our vows. However, the tension was palpable whenever we were forced to be in the same social circle. On the rare occasions we all ended up at the same party or gathering, the energy was electric with discomfort. Sarah would avoid eye contact with Mark entirely, and Mark would spend the whole time at the opposite end of the room, talking loudly to people he barely knew. They acted like two magnets with the same polarity, constantly pushing away from each other. Friends began to notice too. One of our mutual friends asked me privately if Sarah and Mark had a falling out, noting that they hadn't exchanged a single word all night. I laughed it off and said they were both just stressed with work, but inside my stomach was in knots. I felt like I was living in a house of cards and a light breeze was about to knock it all down. Mark's guilt started to manifest in strange ways. He would bring me expensive gifts for no reason, jewelry, designer handbags, or surprise weekend trips, but he still couldn't look me in the eye when we sat down for dinner. It felt like he was trying to buy my silence or perhaps buy off his own conscience. I felt like a guest in my own life, watching two people I loved drift away into a fog I couldn't penetrate. I began to have recurring dreams of my wedding day, but in the dreams, the tears Sarah shed weren't clear. They were black like ink, staining my white dress until I was covered in it. I would wake up gasping for air, reaching for Mark, only to find him turned away from me, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of his phone screen in the middle of the night. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while Mark was in the shower. He had left his old laptop on the kitchen counter and the screen was still glowing. Usually I wouldn't even glance at it, but a notification popped up, an automated reminder from a cloud storage service about memories from 1 year ago. My heart skipped a beat. A year ago we were right in the middle of our engagement, supposedly the happiest time of our lives. I felt a sudden, uncontrollable urge to look at those photos, perhaps to remind myself of the man I thought I married. I clicked the notification, but instead of just opening a gallery of photos, it opened a synced archive of messages and emails from his old account that he had forgotten to log out of. As I scrolled through the dates, my eyes caught a name that made my blood run cold. Sarah. The timestamps were from 3 months before our wedding. I told myself to stop, to close the laptop and walk away, but my hands wouldn't move. I opened the first thread and the world as I knew it began to dissolve. The messages weren't about wedding planning or bridesmaid dresses. They were intense, raw, and devastatingly intimate. I read words written by my husband to my best friend that he had never said to me. He spoke about the wrong timing and the tragedy of finding the right person too late. Sarah's replies were even worse. She wrote about the physical ache of seeing him with me, about the guilt that was eating her alive, and yet she kept responding. They had been meeting in secret at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town and eventually in his car during the late hours when he told me he was staying late at the office. I felt a physical pain in my chest, a sharp stabbing sensation that made it hard to breathe. I saw a message from Sarah sent just 2 weeks before the wedding where she begged him to call it off, saying she couldn't stand to watch him walk toward me. Mark's reply was cold and logical. "It's too late, Sarah. The invitations are out. Everyone expects this. We have to stop. We have to bury this." The intense relationship they shared wasn't just a crush. It was a full-blown emotional and physical affair that had taken place right under my nose while I was picking out flower arrangements and tasting cakes. I saw photos they had sent to each other. Not explicit ones but photos of mundane things like a sunset or a book, captioned with "Thinking of you," and "I wish you were here." Those were the most painful because they showed a deep daily connection that I thought belonged only to me. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, the sound of the shower running upstairs, feeling like a fool. Every stressful day Mark had, every time Sarah was too busy to hang out, it was all a lie. They weren't avoiding each other back then. They were escaping to each other. I realized that while I was dreaming of our future, they were busy mourning a secret life they were forced to end because of the social pressure of our upcoming marriage. My mind raced back to the wedding day, the shaking hands, the uncontrollable sobbing, the "I'm so sorry" whispered in my ear. It wasn't love for me that moved her to tears. It was the finality of losing him. She wasn't my maid of honor. She was a woman watching the man she loved marry her best friend, and he was a man walking toward a life he had already betrayed. The sound of the shower stopping felt like a gunshot in the silent house. I sat frozen, staring at the glowing screen until the text blurred into a mess of blue and white lines. I felt a strange, cold numbness spreading from my fingertips to my heart. It was as if my entire reality had been a beautiful painting, and someone had just thrown a bucket of black ink over it. I heard Mark's footsteps in the hallway, the familiar sound of his humming, and for the first time in 5 years the sound made my skin crawl. He walked into the kitchen, a towel around his waist, smelling of the expensive soap I had bought him for Christmas. He looked at me, then his eyes dropped to the laptop. The humming stopped instantly. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost ghostly. For a long minute neither of us spoke. The only sound was the refrigerator humming and the rain tapping against the window. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just looked at him and asked, "How could you walk down that aisle?" He didn't try to deny it. He didn't even look at the screen to see which messages I had read. He knew exactly what was there. He sat down heavily in the chair opposite me, looking suddenly older, the perfect husband mask finally falling away. He started to stammer, saying it was a moment of weakness, confusion brought on by the stress of the wedding. He told me that he realized his mistake before the ceremony and that he had chosen me. He tried to frame his betrayal as a victory for our marriage, as if deciding to go through with the wedding after cheating was a grand romantic gesture. I felt a wave of nausea. Every memory of our wedding day began to rewrite itself in my head. The way he looked at me at the altar. Was he looking at me or was he looking past me at her? The way he held my hand during the photos. Was he squeezing it because he loved me or because he was trying to ground himself in a lie? He kept talking, his voice becoming more desperate, claiming that it was all in the past and that it didn't mean anything. But the messages told a different story. They spoke of a connection that was deep and desperate. He told her she was the only one who truly understood him. He told her he felt trapped by the expectations of our families. I realized then that I wasn't his partner. I was his safe choice, the woman who fit the life he was supposed to have, while Sarah was the woman he actually wanted. The betrayal felt double-edged. It wasn't just a man cheating on his wife. It was my best friend, my sister, the person I had shared my bed with during sleepovers and my heart with during heartbreaks, conspiring with my partner to keep me in the dark. They had looked at me every day for months, smiling to my face while sharing a secret world behind my back. They had allowed me to spend thousands of dollars on a wedding that was built on a foundation of sand. I looked at Mark and realized I didn't know the man sitting in front of me at all. He was a stranger who happened to be wearing my husband's skin. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, like it had turned into lead. I stayed in that chair for what felt like hours, listening to Mark's voice drone on, but his words were just noise, meaningless vibrations in the air. He tried to reach out and touch my hand, but I flinched as if his skin were made of fire. I couldn't stand the sight of him. Every time I looked at his face, I saw the messages. I saw the timestamps. I saw the betrayal. I finally stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to a stranger, and walked out of the house. I didn't take a coat, I didn't take my purse. I just got into my car and drove. The rain was pouring down now, blurring the world outside just as my life had been blurred. I found myself driving toward Sarah's apartment, the place where I had spent countless nights laughing, drinking wine, and dreaming about the future. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst through my ribs. I parked the car and walked up to her door, my clothes soaked through. When she opened the door, her face went through a terrifying transformation. First there was confusion, then recognition, and finally a deep, hollow terror. He knew. She didn't even have to ask why I was there. She stepped back, letting me into the apartment that smelled like the vanilla candles I had given her for her birthday. I didn't say a word. I just stood in the middle of her living room, dripping water onto her expensive rug, and stared at her. I saw the messages, Sarah, I said, my voice sounding hollow and metallic. She collapsed onto her sofa, covering her face with her hands, and began to sob. But these weren't the beautiful tears from the wedding. These were ugly, jagged sounds of a person who had been caught in a lie they could no longer sustain. She started talking, her words tripping over each other in a desperate rush. She told me she never meant to hurt me. She told me she tried to stop it 100 times. She said that she loved me, that I was her best friend, but that she and Mark had found something unexpected and undeniable. She described their affair as if it were a natural disaster they were victims of, rather than a series of choices they had made every single day. She told me about the nights they spent talking until dawn while I was asleep, believing my life was perfect. She told me that the closer the wedding got, the more she realized she couldn't have him, and the more the guilt began to crush her. That's why I cried at the wedding, she choked out, looking up at me with eyes full of a pathetic kind of hope for forgiveness. I was crying because I was losing him, and I was crying because I knew I was destroying you just by standing there. I looked around her apartment and saw photos of us together on the shelves. Trips to the beach, college graduation, birthdays. In every photo we were smiling, arms wrapped around each other. Now those photos looked like evidence of a crime. I realized that for months, every time she hugged me, she was thinking of him. Every time she helped me pick out flowers or shoes, she was imagining herself in my place. She wasn't my support system. She was my shadow, waiting for the sun to go down so she could take what was mine. The betrayal was so deep that it felt like it had rewritten my entire history. I didn't just lose my husband that day. I lost my childhood, my memories, and my sense of safety in the world. I looked at her, this woman I had called my sister, and I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a profound, echoing emptiness. She reached out to grab my arm, begging me to listen, saying she stayed silent to save our friendship. I pulled away and looked at her with a clarity I had never possessed before. You didn't stay silent to save me, Sarah, I whispered. You stayed silent to save yourself. You wanted to keep your place in my life while you took a place in his. I turned around and walked out, leaving her sobbing on the floor of the apartment I would never enter again. I drove back to the house that was no longer a home, knowing that the girl who walked down that aisle a few months ago was officially dead. When I returned home, the house felt like a museum of a life that had ended 100 years ago. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table exactly where I had left him, surrounded by the remnants of our dinner. The lights were dimmed and the silence was so thick I could almost taste the dust in the air. He tried to stand up when I walked in, his face etched with a desperate, pleading hope, but I walked past him without a word. I went straight to the bedroom, our bedroom, and began to pull things out of the closet. I felt like a machine, moving with a cold, calculated precision that I didn't know I possessed. I grabbed a suitcase and started throwing clothes into it, not caring if they were wrinkled or if they even belonged to me. Mark followed me, standing in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor. He started talking again, a low, frantic murmur that sounded like a prayer. He told me that he had ended it weeks before the wedding, that he had realized he couldn't live without me, and that Sarah was just a distraction from the fear of commitment. He even had the audacity to suggest that his choice to stay with me proved how much he loved me. I stopped packing for a moment and looked at him, truly looked at him, and I saw the cowardice dripping off him like sweat. He wasn't a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who had tried to have everything and ended up with nothing but a pile of lies. You didn't choose me, Mark, I said, my voice steady and sharp. You chose the easy path. You chose to keep your reputation, your comfortable life, and your wedding photos while you broke the soul of the person who trusted you most. He tried to argue, to tell me that we could go to counseling, that we could work through this, but every word out of his mouth felt like more dirt being thrown onto a coffin. I realized that for the past few months I had been living with a ghost. The man I loved, the man I thought was my partner, never actually existed. He was a character he had played for me, while the real Mark was the one sending late-night messages to my best friend. The betrayal wasn't just the physical act or the emotional connection. It was the theft of my time and my reality. He had stolen my wedding day. He had turned what should have been a sacred memory into a scene from a horror movie where the audience knows the killer is in the room, but the victim is still smiling. I looked at the bed where we had slept every night since the honeymoon, and I felt a wave of disgust so strong I had to lean against the dresser. Every "I love you" whispered in the dark, every plan for the future, every touch, it was all tainted. I looked at the wedding ring on my finger, the diamond sparkling under the bedroom lights, and it looked like a piece of cheap glass. I took it off and set it on the nightstand with a quiet click. It felt like a mountain had been lifted off my chest, yet I had never felt more empty. Mark began to cry then, real tears of self-pity, realizing that his words weren't working. He reached for me, but I stepped back into the closet, putting the physical distance between us that had existed emotionally for months. I wasn't just leaving him, I was leaving the version of myself that was naive enough to believe in him. I realized then that the silence I had felt between us wasn't just distance. It was the sound of a secret that had finally grown too large for the walls of our house to hold. I finished packing the first bag and zipped it shut, the sound of the zipper echoing like a final goodbye. I didn't need to hear any more explanations or apologies. The truth was written in the archives of his computer and in the tears of a woman who was supposed to be my sister. I walked out of the bedroom carrying the weight of my new, cold reality, leaving him alone in the room with the ghost of the marriage he had murdered. I spent the next few days in a motel room that smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and old carpets. It was a sterile, lonely place, but it was honest, which was more than I could say for my own home. I kept my phone off for 48 hours, but when I finally gathered the courage to turn it back on, the digital world exploded. There were dozens of missed calls from Mark, hundreds of frantic texts from Sarah, and most painfully, messages from our mutual friends and family. The news of our sudden separation had leaked and people were confused. They remembered the wedding, the beautiful tear-filled ceremony, and they couldn't understand how it could all fall apart so quickly. I sat on the edge of the uncomfortable bed and realized I had to make a choice. I could keep their secret to protect the memory of that day, or I could speak the truth and let the fire burn everything down. I decided that I was done being the only one carrying the weight of the truth. I didn't make a grand public announcement, but when my mother called, I told her everything. When our friends asked, I didn't use euphemisms. I told them that my husband had been having an affair with my maid of honor until the day of the wedding. The fallout was swift and brutal. The social circle we had built together began to fracture. People who had looked at Sarah's tears as a sign of beautiful friendship now looked back at the photos with a sense of horror. The sweet moments from the wedding video were now viewed as evidence of a betrayal so deep it felt Shakespearean. Mark tried to reach out to our friends to explain his side, to paint it as a mistake that happened before the I do's, but the damage was done. He had lost the respect of the people he valued most. Sarah, on the other hand, went into hiding. I heard from a friend that she had taken a leave of absence from her job and moved back to her parents' house in another state. She sent me one last letter, a physical piece of paper that arrived at my motel. In it, she tried to explain that her tears at the wedding were her final goodbye to the version of her that was a traitor. She wrote that she truly believed she could be a good friend to me once the affair was over, that she thought she could bury the secret and love me enough to make up for the betrayal. I burned the letter in the metal trash can of the motel room. The idea that she thought she could compensate for such a wound was the ultimate insult. It showed me that even now she didn't understand the depth of what she had destroyed. She hadn't just stolen a man, she had stolen my ability to trust my own judgment. I started looking back at every memory from the last year, every dinner, every laugh, every secret shared, and I realized I had to reevaluate all of it. Every time I had been sad, she was the one I called. Every time Mark and I had a small argument, she was the one who mediated. Now I saw those moments for what they were. Opportunities for her to gather information to keep us exactly where she wanted us. The complexity of the manipulation was staggering. I realized that the distance I had felt after the wedding wasn't just my imagination. It was the two of them collectively withdrawing because they couldn't stand to look at the victim of their crime. They had expected me to just exist in the background of their shared guilt, a permanent reminder of what they had given up and what they had ruined. But I refused to be a background character in my own tragedy. I contacted a divorce lawyer and began the process of untangling my life from Mark's. It was a cold, clinical process, splitting bank accounts, deciding who got the couch, discussing the lease. Mark tried to fight it at first, begging for a second chance, but I remained like stone. I realized that the woman who had walked down that aisle was gone, replaced by someone who was much harder, much colder, but finally seeing the world for what it really was. I wasn't just divorcing a man, I was divorcing a lie. The process of the divorce was like performing surgery on my own life without any anesthesia. Every document I signed, every box I packed, was a reminder of the elaborate fiction I had been living. Mark's lawyers tried to play the premarital card, arguing that since the affair had technically ended before the wedding, it shouldn't affect the division of our assets. It was a cold, calculated move that showed me exactly who he was. A man who valued his money more than the heart he had shattered. I sat in those gray conference rooms, listening to men in suits talk about infidelity clauses and equitable distribution, while all I could think about was the sound of Sarah's voice in my ear on my wedding day. I finally gained access to the full records of their communication through the discovery process of the legal proceedings, and what I found was even more haunting than the first few messages. It wasn't just a physical attraction, it was a partnership of deceit. They had developed a code for when they could see each other. They used the very wedding planning events as covers for their meetings. When I was at the florist choosing the lilies for my bouquet, they were sitting in a parked car 3 blocks away, discussing how they would handle me after the ceremony. I found a message from Mark to Sarah sent the night before our wedding. He wrote, "I'm looking at her right now and all I can think about is you. But I have to do this. My parents have invested too much and everyone is already in town. Just promise me you'll be there. I need you in the front row so I have something real to look at." Reading those words felt like being doused in ice water. The love he showed me at the altar wasn't just a lie. It was a performance designed to keep the peace while he searched for her face in the crowd. I realized that my wedding was never about me. It was a funeral for their relationship and I was merely the decoration. I spent hours going through my wedding photos, which had finally been delivered in a beautiful leather-bound album that I now wanted to set on fire. I looked at the candid shots the photographer had taken during the reception. In the background of one photo where I am laughing with my cousins, I can see Mark and Sarah in the distance. They aren't looking at me. They are looking at each other with an expression of such profound, mutual misery that I wondered how I could have been so blind. In another photo, Sarah is caught mid-sob during the speeches. At the time, guests thought she was moved by my husband's tribute to me. Now I saw the truth. She was mourning the fact that she had to watch him publicly claim me. The tears weren't for my happiness, they were for her own loss. I felt a strange sense of power in finally knowing the whole truth, even as it destroyed me. The mystery of the distance I felt was gone, replaced by a solid, undeniable reality. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't a jealous wife. I was a woman who had been gaslighted by the two people she loved most. As the final divorce decree was being drafted, I felt a sense of closure that had nothing to do with forgiveness. I didn't forgive Mark and I certainly didn't forgive Sarah. But I began to forgive myself. I forgave myself for trusting them. I forgave myself for not seeing the signs. I realized that my ability to love and trust wasn't a weakness. Their ability to betray was the flaw. I was standing in the empty living room of our apartment, the echoes of our past bouncing off the bare walls, and for the first time in months I felt like I could breathe. I was no longer the safe choice, or the deceived bride. I was a woman who had survived a double betrayal and I was still standing. I took the wedding album, the one filled with photos of a day that was a lie, and I put it in a box at the very back of my storage unit. I wasn't ready to burn it yet, but I was ready to stop looking at it. I was ready to stop being the victim of a story they had written behind my back. A year has passed since the divorce was finalized, and today I found myself standing in front of a mirror, getting ready for a simple dinner with a few co-workers. There were no lace buttons, no lilies, and no shaking hands. The silence in my new apartment wasn't heavy or suffocating like it used to be. It was peaceful. I had spent 12 months rebuilding my life from the ground up. moving to a different part of the city where the streets didn't hold memories of Sarah's favorite coffee shops or Mark's favorite parks. I had stopped checking their social media months ago. From what I heard through the grapevine, they never actually ended up together. The weight of what they had done to me was a poison that eventually killed whatever undeniable connection they thought they had. Without the thrill of the secret and the shared enemy of my ignorance, they were just two people who couldn't trust each other. After all, how can you build a life with someone who helped you betray your best friend or your wife? You would always be waiting for them to do the same to you. As I was looking for a pair of earrings, I stumbled upon a small, forgotten envelope at the bottom of my jewelry box. Inside was a single, candid photo from the wedding that hadn't made it into the official album. It was a shot of me and Sarah, taken from the side as we stood at the altar. I am looking forward, my face radiant with a foolish, beautiful hope. Sarah is slightly behind me, her head bowed, her face a mask of absolute devastation. I looked at her tears in that photo for a long time. For a year I had hated those tears. I had seen them as the ultimate insult, a performance of grief by the person who was actively stabbing me in the back. But looking at them now with the distance of time, I saw them for what they truly were. They were a confession she wasn't brave enough to speak aloud. Those tears were the sound of a door closing. She wasn't just crying for the man she wanted. She was crying because she knew that by the time the sun set that day, she would have effectively murdered our friendship. She was mourning me even while I was standing right next to her. She knew that the "I do" Mark was saying to me was a death sentence for the 20 years of history we shared. Every sob was a nail in the coffin of the girl who had been my sister. I realized then that I didn't need a dramatic confrontation or a grand act of revenge. The loss of me was her punishment. She had to live with the knowledge that she traded a lifetime of loyalty for a few months of a secret that eventually turned to ash. I didn't feel anger as I looked at the photo. I didn't even feel sadness. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of release. I took the photo, walked to the kitchen and placed it in the shredder. I watched as the image of the two girls who used to be best friends was turned into thin, meaningless ribbons of paper. I thought about the wedding photos I still had in storage and realized I didn't need to burn them to be free of them. They were just pictures of a play where the actors had forgotten their lines. My life didn't end when that marriage did. It actually began. I walked out of my apartment, locked the door and stepped into the cool evening air. I wasn't looking back anymore. The tears at my wedding were a veda, a long, painful goodbye, and I had finally moved on to the next chapter. Thank you so much for listening to my story and walking through this journey with me. If this story touched your heart or resonated with your own experiences, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up to support my work. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that turned out to be a blessing in disguise? Your engagement truly helps this community grow, and I appreciate every single one of you. Stay strong, keep moving forward, and I will see you in the next story.